Imagine a battle where 50,000 men march for glory, but only 3,000 return. A defeat so devastating it nearly destroyed one of history's greatest generals. This is the story of the Battle of Kunersdorf, the day when Frederick the Great almost lost everything. On August 12, 1759, during the 7 Years' War, Frederick II of Prussia faced one of the worst defeats of his career. Commanding 50,900 soldiers, he was crushed by a combined army of Russians and Austrians, led by General Pyotr Saltykov. But what began as a promising victory transformed into an epic disaster. Why did Frederick choose to continue fighting, even when victory was within his grasp? And how did this battle alter the course of European history? The morning started with brilliant tactics and bold maneuvers. By noon, Frederick stood on the edge of triumph. Yet by sunset, his army lay in ruins, scattered across the bloody fields of Kunersdorf. In the aftermath, Frederick himself wrote in despair, "All is lost. I will not survive the ruin of my country." How could fortune change so drastically in just a few hours? This wasn't just another military engagement. It was a pivotal moment that tested the limits of leadership, revealed the cost of hubris, and nearly toppled the rising Prussian kingdom. The decisions made that day would echo through generations and reshape the balance of power in 18th century Europe. If you love history and want to unravel the mysteries of great empires like this video, subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles and don't miss a single episode. Join us as we explore how one battle, one fateful decision, nearly changed the face of Europe forever. The 7 Years' War, raging from 1756 to 1763, wasn't just another European conflict. It was the first truly global war. Picture this: battles erupting across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, India, and the Philippines, all happening simultaneously. Some historians even call it the real First World War, fought a century and a half before the one we typically give that name. At the center of this storm stood Frederick II of Prussia, known to history as Frederick the Great. But what drove this enlightened monarch to plunge Europe into chaos? The answer lies in his vision for Prussia, a relatively new power with ambitious dreams of greatness. Frederick inherited a militarized state with a powerful army but limited territory. Prussia was sandwiched between giants: Russia to the east, Austria to the south, and France to the west. Rather than accepting his kingdom's vulnerable position, Frederick chose expansion. He had already seized the wealthy province of Silesia from Austria in earlier conflicts, and his neighbors were growing increasingly concerned about Prussia's rapid rise. This created a diplomatic revolution across Europe. Traditional enemies, France and Austria, put aside centuries of hatred to ally against Prussia. Russia, eager to limit German power on its borders, joined them. Suddenly, Frederick found himself surrounded by a coalition controlling armies 4 times the size of his own. Only Great Britain stood with Prussia, mainly because they needed Frederick to keep French forces tied down in Europe, while British troops fought French colonists in North America and India. The chess pieces were set for what would become one of history's most consequential wars. Did you know that despite the catastrophic defeat at Kunersdorf, Frederick managed an almost miraculous recovery? When the battle ended, he wrote to Berlin that everything was lost and even carried poison with him, contemplating suicide rather than facing capture. Yet within months, he regrouped his scattered forces and continued fighting. Even more remarkably, after 7 years of brutal warfare that nearly destroyed his kingdom, Frederick emerged not weakened, but strengthened. Prussia retained all its territories, including Silesia, and was recognized as a major European power, no longer an upstart kingdom, but a force that had withstood the combined might of Europe's traditional powers. This resilience wasn't just military, it was personal. Frederick himself transformed from a poetry-writing, flute-playing young prince into Old Fritz, a battle-hardened commander who inspired generations of military leaders. Even Napoleon would later visit Frederick's tomb, telling his officers, "Gentlemen, if this man were still alive, I would not be here." The Battle of Kunersdorf was perhaps the darkest chapter in Frederick's story, but as we're about to see, sometimes the most revealing moments in history come not from victories, but from how leaders respond to devastating defeat. To understand the Battle of Kunersdorf, we must first meet the remarkable personalities who commanded these massive armies. This wasn't just a clash of military forces, but a collision of commanding styles, egos, and strategic visions. On one side stood Frederick II of Prussia, already known throughout Europe as Frederick the Great. He was no ordinary monarch. Born into military tradition, Frederick had transformed Prussia's army into what many considered the finest fighting force in Europe. But behind the military genius was a complex man, a philosopher king who corresponded with Voltaire, composed music, and wrote poetry. This same cultured intellect gave him a strategic mind that repeatedly allowed him to defeat larger enemy forces. Frederick's greatest strength and fatal weakness was his boldness. He had made his reputation through audacious gambits and lightning-fast maneuvers that opponents simply couldn't anticipate. At 47 years old during Kunersdorf, Frederick had grown dangerously accustomed to victory. His confidence bordered on arrogance. He believed in the superiority of Prussian discipline and drill, having watched his meticulously trained infantry perform miracles on previous battlefields. Opposing him stood Pyotr Saltykov, a 60-year-old Russian general who had been appointed commander just 1 year earlier. What makes this fascinating is that Saltykov had never commanded an army in battle before Kunersdorf. Many expected him to be outmatched by Frederick's experience, but Saltykov proved to be surprisingly shrewd. Unlike Frederick's flamboyant style, Saltykov was cautious and methodical. He chose excellent defensive positions and, crucially, knew when to listen to his more experienced subordinates. The third key figure was Austrian commander Ernst Gideon von Laudon. At 42 years old, Laudon was a military prodigy with a remarkable backstory. Did you know he had actually applied to join the Prussian army years earlier? But Frederick personally rejected him, supposedly because of his unimpressive appearance. This rejection created a lifelong rivalry, with Laudon determined to prove Frederick wrong at every opportunity. Laudon was considered a master of cavalry tactics, and he kept his Austrian horsemen in reserve during the critical moments of battle, a decision that would ultimately seal Frederick's fate. While Frederick exhausted his forces in frontal assaults, Laudon patiently waited for the perfect moment to unleash his cavalry upon the tired Prussians. What made this three-way command dynamic so interesting was how they complemented each other. Saltykov provided steady leadership and selected the battlefield terrain masterfully. Laudon contributed tactical brilliance and timing. Together, they created a command team that could match Frederick's genius. Frederick's greatest miscalculation at Kunersdorf wasn't tactical. It was psychological. He simply couldn't believe that these commanders, whom he regarded as inferior, could withstand his best punches. He had defeated Russian armies before. He had bested Austrian forces repeatedly. The idea that they could not only resist, but decisively defeat his vaunted Prussian forces seemed impossible to him. As Frederick surveyed the battlefield that morning in August 1759, he saw only the victory ahead, not the disaster that would unfold. This battle would reveal that even the greatest military minds can be undone by underestimating their opponents, a lesson Frederick would never forget. Dawn broke over the fields near Kunersdorf on August 12, 1759. The summer heat was already building as Frederick's troops took their positions. What happened next would become one of military history's greatest what-if moments. Frederick, always the bold strategist, identified a weakness in the Russian left flank. Rather than attacking where the enemy expected, directly into their strongest defenses, he orchestrated a brilliant flanking maneuver. The Prussian forces moved through wooded areas, emerging unexpectedly on the Russian left. The surprise was complete. At 5 in the morning, Prussian artillery opened fire, followed by waves of Frederick's legendary infantry. The disciplined Prussian battalions moved with mechanical precision, advancing, firing, reloading, all while steadily pushing forward. By midday, they had captured the key position known as the Mühlberg, seized nearly 100 Russian cannons, and completely shattered the Russian left wing. Blood soaked the sandy soil as Russian soldiers retreated in disarray. This was Frederick's moment of triumph. His brother Prince Heinrich, who commanded part of the Prussian force, sent an urgent message. "We have won enough for one day. The enemy is in confusion. We should consolidate our gains and prepare for tomorrow." Heinrich wasn't being cautious without reason. The Prussian troops had been marching since 3 in the morning and had been fighting in sweltering heat for hours. The men were exhausted, thirsty, and low on ammunition. Had Frederick heeded this advice, Kunersdorf would be remembered as yet another brilliant Prussian victory. Military historians today agree that a partial victory was within his grasp. The Russians had been bloodied, their left flank crushed, and Frederick could have withdrawn to a stronger position with captured enemy guns as his trophies. But something drove Frederick to push further. Perhaps it was the intoxication of success, or his desire to deliver a knockout blow that would force Russia out of the war entirely. Maybe it was simply his indomitable will that had served him so well in previous campaigns. Whatever the reason, Frederick made the fateful decision to continue the attack. "We must finish what we've started," he reportedly told his generals. "The Russians are on the verge of collapse. One more push, and they will break completely." This decision transformed what could have been a glorious victory into a catastrophic defeat. What Frederick didn't fully appreciate was the strength of the Russian center and right wing, which remained fresh and unmolested. Even more critically, he underestimated the difficulty of the terrain his tired troops would need to cross, a series of steep ravines and hills that would break the cohesion of his formations. As Frederick ordered his weary men forward into what became known as Lodon's Hollow, they were moving straight into a death trap. The Russian guns opened fire from elevated positions, while Austrian forces waited for the perfect moment to counterattack. Imagine watching this unfold. Frederick's victorious army, which had performed so brilliantly just hours earlier, now marching directly into a firestorm, their neat formations disintegrating as they struggled across broken ground under relentless artillery fire. This was the turning point, the moment when victory slipped through Frederick's fingers and transformed into disaster. Did you know that Frederick almost gave up after this devastating defeat? If you're enjoying this video, like it, share it, and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more incredible stories. And tell us in the comments, do you think Frederick should have stopped the attack when he was winning? As the August sun began its descent toward the horizon, Frederick's gamble was unraveling before his eyes. His exhausted Prussian infantry, who had been fighting since dawn, found themselves bogged down in difficult terrain. Their earlier momentum had vanished. Ammunition was running low. Many soldiers were collapsing from heat and thirst. The attack that had begun with such promise was grinding to a halt against unexpectedly stubborn Russian resistance. This was the moment Ernst Gideon von Lauden had been waiting for. The Austrian commander had carefully held his cavalry in reserve, keeping them fresh while the battle raged. As he watched the Prussian formations lose cohesion, Lauden knew his time had come. With perfect timing, he gave the order that would change the course of the battle, and perhaps of European history. 4,000 Austrian cavalrymen, their horses well rested and eager, suddenly thundered onto the battlefield. The sound alone must have struck terror into the hearts of the exhausted Prussians. Imagine the scene, gleaming sabers catching the late afternoon sun as this wall of horsemen crashed into the flank of Frederick's struggling army. The Prussian infantry, already at their breaking point, couldn't form defensive squares quickly enough to repel cavalry charges, a fatal vulnerability on any 18th century battlefield. What followed wasn't just a defeat, it was a complete disintegration of the Prussian army. The disciplined force that had been the envy of Europe crumbled under the combined pressure of Russian firepower and Austrian cavalry. Frederick desperately tried to rally his men, personally leading counterattacks and reportedly having 2 horses shot out from under him. At one point, he was nearly captured when a Russian bullet struck his coat, but was saved by a gold snuff box in his pocket that deflected the shot, one of history's luckiest escapes. Despite Frederick's personal courage, the rout was total. The Prussian retreat turned into a panicked flight. Soldiers threw away their weapons and equipment as they ran. The armies of Russia and Austria relentlessly pursued the fleeing Prussians, cutting down thousands who couldn't escape fast enough. The statistics tell a truly shocking story. Of the 50,900 Prussian soldiers who had marched confidently into battle that morning, only 3,000 made it back to Berlin in organized units, while many others eventually straggled back to Prussian territory in the following weeks. The immediate aftermath suggested almost total annihilation. Frederick's magnificent army, the force he had built with such care over decades, had virtually ceased to exist in a single day. The psychological impact on Frederick himself was devastating. This man, who had built his reputation on military genius, found himself facing the unthinkable. In the immediate aftermath, he wrote one of the most despairing letters ever penned by a great commander. "All is lost. I will not survive the ruin of my country." So complete was his despair that Frederick carried a vial of poison with him in the days following Kunersdorf, contemplating suicide rather than face capture or further humiliation. The Allies, Russia and Austria, now had a golden opportunity to march on Berlin, possibly ending the war and dismembering the Prussian state entirely. With Frederick's main army destroyed, little stood between the Allied forces and the Prussian capital. The fate of Prussia hung by the thinnest of threads. Yet in one of history's most remarkable twists, the Allies failed to capitalize on their victory. General Saltykov, cautious by nature and concerned about his own heavy losses, approximately 15,000 Russian and Austrian casualties, refused to pursue the broken Prussian forces. "I've already taken my share of victories," he reportedly told his Austrian counterparts. "Now it's your turn to act." This disagreement between the Allies gave Frederick precious time to recover, time he would use with characteristic determination. The disaster at Kunersdorf teaches us that even the greatest military minds can miscalculate, and that victory often hinges not just on brilliant planning, but on knowing when to stop. Frederick's near destruction at Kunersdorf would transform him as a leader. Gone was some of the youthful arrogance, replaced by a more measured approach to warfare. Though the war would continue for years, Frederick would never again risk everything on a single roll of the dice, as he had done on that fateful August day in 1759. The Battle of Kunersdorf stands as a watershed moment in the career of Frederick the Great. In the span of a single day, we witnessed how fortune can dramatically reverse, how brilliant success can transform into catastrophic failure. But perhaps the most important chapter of this story isn't the battle itself, but what happened afterward. Just imagine the scene. Frederick, the man who had built Prussia into a European power, sitting alone in his tent the night after Kunersdorf, writing by candlelight that all was lost. With only 3,000 organized troops remaining from his army of 50,000, the situation seemed hopeless. The Russians and Austrians could march on Berlin. Prussia itself might cease to exist. Yet here lies the most remarkable part of this story, Frederick's extraordinary resilience. Within days of contemplating suicide, he began the painstaking work of rebuilding. Deserters were gathered, new recruits were trained, resources were marshaled from every corner of his kingdom. Against all odds, within months, Frederick had rebuilt an army capable of continuing the fight. This comeback represents one of history's greatest examples of perseverance in the face of disaster. Frederick would later write, The greatest test of a man is not how he behaves in moments of comfort, but how he stands in times of challenge and controversy. Kunersdorf was his greatest challenge, and his response revealed the true depth of his character. The war would continue for 4 more grueling years after Kunersdorf. Through diplomatic skill, military innovation, and sheer determination, Frederick managed to hold his enemies at bay. When peace finally came in 1763, Prussia retained all its territories, including the contested Silesia. The kingdom that had stood on the brink of annihilation emerged as a recognized European power. Frederick himself was transformed by Kunersdorf. The younger Frederick had been brilliant but impetuous. The post-Kunersdorf Frederick became more measured, more calculating, and paradoxically more effective. He would rule for another 23 years after the 7 Years' War, implementing reforms that modernized Prussia and laid the groundwork for Germany's eventual unification a century later. Kunersdorf teaches us timeless lessons about leadership and human nature. It shows that even the greatest minds can be blinded by overconfidence. It demonstrates how quickly fortune can change on the battlefield and in life. Yet most importantly, it reveals that our defining moments often come not in victory, but in how we respond to devastating defeat. When Frederick's descendant, Kaiser Wilhelm II, faced his own military catastrophe at the end of the First World War, he lacked Frederick's resilience and fled into exile. The contrast couldn't be clearer. Frederick faced his darkest hour and emerged stronger, while Wilhelm crumbled under similar pressure. The next time you face your own personal Kunersdorf, a moment when everything seems lost, remember Frederick's example. The path from disaster to triumph begins with the refusal to accept defeat as final. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most consequential battles, please hit the like button, share this video with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more content exploring the dramatic events that shaped our modern world. What other historical battles or leaders would you like us to cover next? Let us know in the comments below. Until our next historical journey together, remember that history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the human experience in all its triumph and tragedy.